Hi, my name is Natalie Crane. I'm 23 years old. I'm 5'7". I'm available for the duration of this contract as well as all callback dates, and I am sad. Hello, fellow thespians. My name is Natalie Crane. I am the creator and host of this podcast, Mental Health in Musical Theater. Thank you so much for tuning in for my first premiere debut episode, Hello, Depression. Before I begin, I just wanted to insert a mental health crisis text line. If you're struggling and you feel like you have nobody to talk to and no one to turn to, there is help out there. If you text HOME, HOME, to 274-1741, you'll be connected to a volunteer crisis counselor. I know asking for help is incredibly hard, but you're not alone and your existence is important. Like I said, my name is Natalie Crane. I am a recently graduated BFA musical theater student and performer, and I am mentally ill. A lot of mental health issues, diagnosed laundry list of chemical imbalances. I am not a mental health professional. I'm not a psychologist or a therapist, but I am mentally ill, and I have a lot of experience in being mentally ill, and instead of choosing to suppress it and ignore it for the rest of my life, I chose to embrace it and discover more about it and the ways that it affects me and my life and those around me. For this podcast, I want to be a source of hope that it is perfectly possible to have a lot of mental health issues and to still find joy and success in theater. I'm also just going to make the disclaimer now that my opinions are completely subjective. I simply have a lot of them and wanted a place to put them. That could maybe be a source of relatability for people. I think there has been a lot of increased exposure about mental health of musical theater professionals, and there is a completely new wave of expression addressing weighted topics such as mental illness in the industry, but I still don't feel like there's enough, and I just want to be a part of that. I wanted to start this podcast to speak on things involving mental health and the industry, but also talk about how I manage my mental health as an artist and how I separate my art from who I am as a person. And it's definitely still an ongoing journey and it will always be growing, but I've come a long way in the past few years with my mental health, and I think it's an exciting thing. Looking back where I used to be, even just 3 years ago, I'm a completely different person in terms of the state of my mental health, and it has drastically affected my work as well. And I just want to be a source of hope that it is possible to heal while you're still actively in the performing arts industry. So for today's podcast, I wanted to go in depth about what theater means to me and how I started theater and where I am with it today, as well as how my mental health issues coincide and also live like a separation from theater. I'll also talk about some research that I've been doing involving mental health and theater and being a performer in the industry. There's a lot of really good educated insight out there on mental health in performance that I want to use to support myself throughout this podcast, so I will certainly be doing that throughout the duration of my show. I'll have interviewees of my colleagues and close friends and peers who know a thing or two about being a little mentally ill. I have a whole list of topics and diagnoses that I want to talk about, and it will certainly expand as we go. My next episode, I'll have my close friend and colleague, Jack Bausch. We'll be talking about what the musical theater grind is, and then we'll go from there. So yeah, I am a 23-year-old mentally ill performance major from Nebraska. I had a pretty great childhood up until I was about 9 years old. My mother passed away when I was 9, tragically. And ever since then, I've just developed a plethora of preceding mental health issues. But I have always been a performer. I was that girly that would make up dances in the front yard, and my neighbors and I would make music videos. I have so many fond memories of trying to create these shitty music videos to Jar of Hearts by Christina Perri. I feel like that's a universal experience. But yeah, I've always been keen on performing, and I've always had an affinity for singing and dancing. And I didn't really start theater until middle school, but I was always in choir. I was an athlete. I was a cheerleader and a soccer player in middle school, and that kind of took priority for a little while until I discovered how passionate I actually was about performing when I was a freshman in high school. But, the bug was caught very early on in my life, and I just didn't know what to do with it until high school. Because I had a lot of mental health issues as a child, I found a lot of solace in performing like a lot of us do. It was a safe space. It was a place where I could be with a community of people who felt the same passion and excitement about performing as I did. It was a place where I felt good at something, and I felt like there is such a large spider on my wall right now. One moment, please. Excuse my interruption. The spider has been disposed of safely outside. I don't kill bugs because once I saw that poem on TikTok in one of those poetry dumps that was like being killed for the crime of being small, like ever since I read that poem, I just can't bring myself to kill any bugs, and it kills me inside a little bit knowing that there's spiders living rent-free in my home, but I just am so sensitive. So yeah, I was always in the performing arts as a kid. And it was very special to me, and it was the one thing that I knew that I was going to continue doing for a long time. But I was, constantly dealing with my chemically imbalanced brain. And it made me realize a lot of things early on about how my mental health and my involvement in performance coincided with each other. And these equations weren't, equally balanced in terms of positive and negative. But there were pros and cons to performing in terms of my mental health. And a lot of the pros included like it being an escape, it being a place of, sanctuary, and I had all my friends from performing, but it was also a breeding ground for my perfectionism tendencies and my anxiety and just like lower sense of self-worth. All that stuff was just brewing early on, and I just didn't know, and I thought that was just part of it. And like any standard institutionalized extracurricular activity, there's always going to be those creations of feeling the need to be a certain way in order to perform to a certain expectation. Artists are some of the most dedicated and hardworking people I have ever met. And with hard work comes incredibly high standards. There is this perpetuated notion that in order to be a successful, hardworking person, you have to put your entire life aside for that work. This includes your mental health issues. I'm sure it works for some people, but suppression has never been a positive way of operating for me. In instances where I have chosen to suppress my emotions, they always just come up later in a more explosive and negative way than they were existing before I suppressed them. And this is not me saying we should be allowed to express our feelings at every moment of every second of every day. I'm saying that in an environment that is so fast-paced and strenuous, there isn't a lot of space for self-care. It's sort of something you have to figure out on your own, like any job or career. But theater people specifically are so incredibly dedicated and devoted to their craft that as an artist, it's extremely difficult to separate your personal life from your artistic life. And this brings me to the suffer for your art mentality. I'm of the opinion that you simply don't have to suffer for something to be great. My reason for creating this podcast isn't to advocate for, not working hard, but as artists, it is almost always the norm to be completely absorbed in your art 24/7, even when you're not actively doing it. You're thinking about it still, or you're planning when you're going to practice next, and there's just never enough space for peace. I am an advocate for peace and mental health and self-care. And I do believe it is incredibly possible to take care of yourself and to also have a successful career. My partner is a collegiate soccer player, and he's incredible. And the conversations that we have about his struggles in his sport versus my struggles in theater, the terms soccer and theater are completely interchangeable because we experience the exact same standards of being good enough and feeling like you're not in the right place and literally working your entire life to get to a place where you can go to a good school for what you've prepared for and then not feeling good enough. And we also talked about how there's just extreme parallels in having to pay to play, and to be able to reach a professional level, it requires you to have ultimate connections and a lot of money. And you prepare for your entire life, basically, if this is something that you discovered that you wanted to do early on, which is what Alex and I both had in terms of our sport. And you work your entire life towards getting into a good school, getting a grade so you can get into the good school, getting good grades so you can get a scholarship so you can get into the good school and then be able to pay for it. Even after all of that hard work, it still, a lot of the time, doesn't feel good enough, because that's just the competitive nature of the kinds of activities that we were doing, and those activities then turned into career paths. So when you spend so much of your life preparing to only be this, it becomes your entire personality. And it's really hard to stray away from that. And that's kind of where I'm currently sitting, in this weird, limbo period of trying to figure out who I am away from performing. I have a lot of passions. I love to cook, I love to sew, I love to write poetry, I love to draw and paint, I'm a coffee connoisseur, I love gardening, but theater specifically it was everything to me positively. And it was also the reason for a lot of the issues that I have now. And I think that's 100% a universal experience for every performer. Theater has crafted who I am as a person. It has created my best version of myself, and it has also created this perfectionist and people-pleasing need for validation type of person. And this has created this awareness of how much of these tendencies have bled into everything that I do in my life, not just performing. I am self-diagnosed recovering people pleaser, and I feel that my people pleasing tendencies have come because I have been, conditioned to search for validation in theater. You walk into a room to be judged and critiqued on who you are, what you look like, what you sound like, how you act as a person versus literally how you act. It is an extremely competitive industry, and when you grow up and are trained in an environment to learn how to navigate constantly being criticized, you become an expert at people pleasing, not just in the auditioning room or the rehearsal room or during performance, but in your everyday life. And I'm not saying everyone in the industry is like this. I've met plenty of people that are not this way, and I admire those people, and I'm trying to become one of those people myself. But you develop an addiction to validation as a performer, and this craving for validation is insatiable. There is a drug-similar feeling to performing and to auditioning, and it is chemical. I'm reading a book right now called Dopamine Nation by Dr. Anna Lemke. And it is a scientific explanation of dopamine in the brain and finding balance in the age of indulgence and why we instinctually choose a culture of overconsumption. And while reading this book, I was able to make so many realizations as to why the behavior of auditioning and performing is so addictive. I've discovered that as a human being, not just a performer, I have become addicted to the chase of things in my relationships, in the way that I criticize myself, but especially with auditioning, I find that my brain responds more to things that could be and not things that are there already. It's like the chaos versus safety mentality. My brain is going to constantly gravitate towards the chaos because that's just what it is constantly riding on, is ups and downs of dopamine. And Obsidian is speaking his mind as well right now about this. I don't know if I've mentioned this, but I have a cat named Obsidian. He's a black cat. And he's very vocal, and he will most likely become a guest artist and host on this podcast because he has a lot to say, just like his mother. When I am on stage, I just kind of become someone else, and it's a really comforting feeling, which is probably not the healthiest, but it's also empowering to be able to embody so many different types of people and people that have strengths and weaknesses that aren't your own, but also you're able to relay your own into them. And the community aspect of performing and the pleasure of performing for an audience and being able to provide that for people and entertain people in a time of peril and strife and suffering. There's really nothing like it. And I think that's why being a performer is so glamorized, because it looks glamorous and it feels glamorous when you are on that stage most of the time. And for those, however long the show is, 2 hours, you kind of just are able to forget about all the things that you're dealing with in your regular life. I've always been told theater shouldn't be therapy, but it is, and it's not something that I choose to be my therapy. Like, I go to a regular trained therapist every week, and there's still nothing more comforting than doing something that you're good at and you love passionately. Theater also makes me feel completely valid in my emotions, and those emotions are welcome and necessary. And I'm able to produce quality work because of the emotional depth that I do have. And I feel like that's always been a strength of mine, is to be able to access those places that in other situations are difficult to access. Like, I've never had a singular problem with being vulnerable and open about how I feel. And so it comes in handy in acting. But unfortunately, it feels like it's only welcome when I'm pretending to feel those things. In fact, it's applauded and praised. But in real life, I've always felt like I was too much. And so I've made it my goal for the rest of my life, but starting, a year ago, I would say, to be more accepting of who I am and what I come with. And that includes my emotional depth and vulnerability in and out of acting. There is a scoping article about a study, or a research scheme by Dr. Lucy Clements that Equity actually did, like Actors Equity Association, on their website. And 111 different studies that were done related to mental health and well-being in students and professionals within the performing arts. Equity commissioned this study. Some stats from that show they found that depression is 2 times more likely in performers than the general population. And 54% of musical theater students reported a level of depression and anxiety that met the rate for a diagnosis of a mental disorder. So the fact that over half of the musical theater student population is eligible to be diagnosed for a mental disorder should be raising more alarm than I feel like it is currently. I went to a conservatory at the beginning of my college career, and then I transferred to a liberal arts program that was in the style of conservatory, but it wasn't technically a conservatory. And from my time at the actual conservatory, I had never witnessed such a state of collective suffering. Just the nature of being in a conservatory program was like dying to learn, basically. The grind of a musical theater student in college is a grind of no other. Also so fucking expensive to attend a performing arts college. So we have this expectation to go to school and get educated about being a performer, do all these extremely stressful auditions for colleges, get into said college, attend said college, spend said money, and also expected to live a normal life. Equity actually launched a mental health charter at this panel event that they did to mark Mental Health Awareness Week. Now, before I start talking about this, let me just say that I do not think it's fair that only people that are a part of the Actors Equity Association can have access to these services. I wish that it was accessible to all people in the performing arts industry, but, union. But hey, you can pay your way in. Basically, it's just like a special psychological support for performers, or creative practitioners is how they state it. It's through BAPAM, which is the British Association for Performing Arts Medicine, and they specialize in working with people in the creative industries. It says you can receive up to 6 sessions of individual therapy online. There's also group support therapy online for 6 weeks, and it's a group meeting for 60 minutes led by a psychotherapist of BAPAM's team. It says that they are doing this to bring about deep-rooted structural reform, which I think is wonderful and needs to happen right away. And it says this includes producers and engagers addressing the harmful impacts of precarious work by improving pay and work-life balance and adopting relevant safeguards in the workplace, such as mental health risk assessments, safe space policies, and consultation on organizational change. I think this is a great step in the expansion of mental health acceptance and awareness in the industry, but it's still only being offered to equity actors. It's like only the people that are equity deserve mental health care. But, it is a union, and I get that, but there are so many non-union actors that deserve this same resource. But anyways, I just wanted to include this because if you are an equity actor, this is an option. I'm still sort of confused about if this is only available in the UK. If it's with equity, I think they're just actually partnering with the British Association for Performing Arts Medicine. So it should be available in the United States. But I thought it was worth mentioning. But I feel like if equity is acknowledging that mental health needs to stop being ignored and pushed under the rug in the industry, then we all should be able to start speaking more on it. So in the past, I've had the tendency to overshare about my mental health issues specifically. And it was never an extremely weird and awkward scenario, but it was like to people that I would confide in or like my friends. It was more of a casual explanation as to why I was acting the way that I was at a certain time for me. Because to me, my mental health issues were casual in terms of relevancy in my life because they were always there. Like it was just casual for me to constantly be on the verge of crisis every single day. But part of being mentally ill and a person that has experienced significant life-altering trauma is you have to learn how sharing that information with other people might not just land immediately well with them. It's a very uncomfortable thing to experience, obviously. And so when you just come out and say, yeah, my mom tragically died when I was 9, a lot of the time people don't know what to say and how to respond to that. And it's uncomfortable and awkward, and most often people feel bad. Like, it's just not a comfy thing. And I used to be of the mindset of like, oh, well, it's my trauma. Of course, it's going to make me feel worse because I'm the one that's experiencing it. But like, no, that's not entirely true. Human beings are very complex creatures, and you never know how somebody is going to react to something, and you don't know how it will affect somebody. And so I had all of these massive emotions and a difficult time controlling them. And I had a lot of social anxiety and depression. I also was undiagnosed with borderline personality disorder and bipolar disorder up until like a year ago. So I was dealing with a lot of these symptoms from all of these undiagnosed and diagnosed mental illnesses and disorders that I had, and I wasn't dealing with them very well. And this would create a lot of issue and conflict within my career. I always felt ashamed of it, and I always felt embarrassed and like nobody wanted to talk to me sometimes because of it. And I felt inconsistent in my work because I was. I had an experience with a show that I was in where I got injured, and turns out I have something called injury trauma. My therapist explains it as such. So my mom died in a way in which she got an infection from an injury that she sustained, and that infection spread to her bloodstream and it killed her. And that carried over into my life, and I developed a fear of being injured, I guess. And I had never been injured before this show, like ever. I sprained both my ankles, and I was suffering from a lot of knee pain. Ankle sprains were grade 2 sprains. They kept getting worse because I kept dancing on them. But I was so upset about these injuries. And I thought at the time it was just because I had to sit out of this show that I was working on. But really there was this like emotional reaction and physical reaction that my body was having to getting an injury that was changing an event in my life. And at the time I didn't understand it, and I was like, why am I being so emotional about this? Why is this affecting me so deeply? Why is this so painful for me right now? It's literally, I sprained my fucking ankle. Like, it's not a big deal. But in my head and in my heart, I was devastated. And of course I was devastated because I had to sit out of a show, but like it was a lot deeper than that. And I told my therapist about this, and she was like, well, have you ever considered the connection that you have with injury and your mother and her passing? And I was like, wait a damn minute. And I was like, oh my God, you're right. Every time I had a twinge of pain in my body, or there was something that happened that could result in an injury, I was like, well, all right, guess I'm going to die. It was that serious in my head. Simply My body was keeping score in those instances. I'm working through it now. I'm getting a lot better in that regard. But yeah, because I was having experiences like this, I felt so ashamed and angry at myself for the longest time. I was like, are you seriously not able to control your emotion over something so insignificant? I beat myself up about it for so long, and I was so embarrassed about it for so long. But I've finally come to a place where I'm able to look back and be like, oh, it's okay. You were just having a trauma response. It's okay that happened. I'm actively working on making sure that things like that happen less now. But in my head, while it was actively happening, I was like, oh my God, everyone probably thinks I'm being so dramatic and over emotional, because that's what it was presenting as. And I didn't want to have to explain that I wasn't having a normal reaction because of things that I didn't want to have to share and make people uncomfortable about. It was just this really challenging situation that I had to navigate. And I learned so much from that experience, actually, about myself. And also what I was talking about earlier about how you have to be able to read the room. People are only going to understand to the extent that they do. And that is a philosophy that I live by now. Because I spent so long trying to make people understand that I was sad and that I had suffered trauma. And it seemed like nobody ever did, because no one could except me. You can try, you will fail, unfortunately. It's just the reality of it, and the reality of the stigma behind it, because it is such a weighted thing. People are uncomfortable hearing about things that are uncomfortable. And until I came to terms with that, I really struggled with feeling like there was something extremely wrong with me. But when it all comes down to it, oversharing is just an indication that the person wants to be listened to. And I think that's really all I wanted subconsciously. I've grown a lot since then. But it's situations like that I went through that made me want to advocate for the destigmatization of how mental health issues can and will impact you if you're a performing arts person. On the topic of depression, I have had depression since I was 10, and doggy. If you have depression, you understand how difficult it is to exist a lot of the time. It comes in waves and have extremely high highs and extremely low lows. And even when I was in those low lows, I still wanted to try, and I definitely failed a lot of the time, but I still wanted to try to go to class, go to rehearsal, keep up, but it didn't work all the time. You have to have a lot of consistency. I was going to say motivation, but I think it's more about consistency. Obviously you need motivation, but you have to be motivated to be consistent as a performer. And I struggled with being consistent a lot in college, especially. And I really didn't understand myself at this time in my life. I was really lost, and I didn't know if I even wanted to be a performer anymore, because I was just so depleted of any motivation and consistency and passion. And I lost that drive for a while because I was so depressed. My sense of self-worth was so intensely low, and it was bleeding into my career at that point and what I was able to bring to the table, and I was just fucking tired of it. Career aside, I was just fucking tired of hating myself. A little backstory with my history on medication. I've been on medication since I was 10 for depression. I was a Lexapro girly. I was a Prozac girly. I was also an Adderall girly. So I was constantly on medication, elementary school, middle school, and high school. And once I reached college, I made the executive decision to sort of test out my brain capacities and see if I was able to function properly without medication. And I didn't just cut cold turkey all at once. I sort of weaned off of all of the meds that I was on. So I spent about 3 years of my adult life being unmedicated while also enduring a BFA musical theater program. Looking back, I'm like, that is such a deadly combination, girl. I don't know. I think I was just trying to prove something to myself. So what I'm referencing in terms of the time that I was extremely lost was the time that I was unmedicated. It was also post-COVID. It was not cute. So I really had to make the executive decision and effort to get better. And this came after a lot of experiences in the theater that made me feel like there was something very wrong with me. There was this one time I was workshopping a scene from A Streetcar Named Desire in an acting class, and I simply was so anxious the entire time because it was the birthday dinner scene and I was playing Blanche, and that material just wasn't comfy for me, but I just didn't know that really at the time, I guess, and I think my body definitely knew it. If you're not familiar with the birthday party scene from A Streetcar Named Desire, it's a scene where the character of Blanche, she's basically getting screamed at and screaming. She's getting screamed at by a man and fighting with him and her sister in a very passionate and aggressive manner. And she actually has a panic attack in the scene. And so, of course, I was going to go there. And I did, and I thought that I was doing it in the safest manner possible, but clearly my body did not respond that way, and I froze in the middle of this workshop. And when asked about my character and what she was thinking, doing, you know, all the questions that your teacher asks you when you're working on a scene, I had no answers. I think I remember saying, I don't know. Like... When my teacher asked me, what is your character thinking or something? And I was just like, I don't know. And that shit was so embarrassing. Like, I knew it was happening in the moment. I was like, God, I probably look like such a fucking idiot. I probably look like I didn't prepare, blah, blah, blah. But I was panicking. I was trying not to piss my pants and go into a blackout panic attack. And that was just an example of one of the situations that happened during my time being unmedicated in theater school that I was like, okay, that really needs to not happen anymore. What can I do to make sure that this stops happening? Summer after the semester of when I had that streetcar named Disaster, I fell into a horrible depression. It was one of those, like, wake up, either lay in bed or I moved to my couch. Most of the time I moved to my couch and I would just sit there all day. And then I would go to rehearsal for the show that I was in at night. It was the nastiest bout of depression that I think I've had in a really long time. And I couldn't take my trash out. It was piling up. The dishes were piled. It was dirty in my apartment. I'm a very clean person. I do not like dirt and grime and grossness in my space, but it was fucking dirty in there because I had no motivation to care about it. I just mentally, I was just not thriving at all. Granted, the depression episode wasn't just random. A lot of things had happened at the end of the year that impacted that. One of them including the show where I was injured. I was still treating those injuries during the summer, and that made me extremely depressed because I couldn't do much. And somebody that was really close to me was actually killed at the end of the semester in a hit and run accident. And that drastically affected my mental health. And that was extremely tough. I'd never felt that close to rock bottom before. And so the next semester was the first semester of my senior year. This is starting to sound like a big pharma ad, but really, along with the chemical changes from my medication, I had reached that point where I had to ask myself, do you really want to feel this way for the rest of your life? I need medication to function, and there is nothing wrong with that. And I completely understand not wanting to be on medication because it feels shameful to say, I can't function properly without drugs. I'm talking about pharmaceuticals, by the way, in case anyone had any wonderings about that. But it is okay to be on medication if you have mental illnesses because it's not your fault. There's just really nothing you can do about it besides alter your brain chemistry or change your lifestyle. And for me, I was trying to change my lifestyle, but it still just wasn't, something wasn't clicking still. It was a new medication that I was on. It was one I hadn't taken before. It was an SSNI, not an SSRI, and so it aided in my ADHD tendencies as well. It really helped me manage my emotions better. I still feel all of my emotions on my meds, but they don't overshadow everything anymore. So wasn't skipping class anymore and doing really well in school, and I was showing up and producing better work. But this was because I had to actively make the decision to do something about it and to take a hold of my mental health, because I had never been able to do that before now. And it wasn't like I'm going to conquer this and kill it off. I'm going to heal now. I'm going to allow myself the space to heal from things that I never talked about or I knew were destroying me inside, but I just would ignore them. Like, I am in my healing girl era. Now, this is not all to say that I don't still struggle on the daily, on the reg. I definitely do. I still have bipolar disorder. I still have BPD. I still have anxiety and depression. It's still all there. It's just becoming easier to manage now. Something about me is I find so much joy and help in helping other people. If my experiences can make somebody else's feel valid, then I will talk about them. I'm no longer ashamed to talk about my mental health issues and to talk about the ugliness of it, because if I was, that would be a complete disservice to myself and everything that I've gone through to get to where I am now. And I can only hope that through this podcast journey that I'm on, I can provide a space for people to feel seen and heard, and for people to have a reference of affirmation and security that it's okay if you struggle to hide your mental illnesses for the sake of others and for the sake of your career. It's okay to be human and to struggle openly and not silently. Something that I tell myself all the time throughout my recovery journey and my healing journey is I want to look back and say that I was alive and that I tried. So this is me trying. Let's keep it going. That is all I have today for this first episode. Thank you so much again for all of the support that I've already received and am continuing to receive. It genuinely means the world to me. I am over the moon excited about this. I do have an Instagram account for this pod at Mental Health and Musical Theater. I also have a YouTube channel that I'm going to post all my pod episodes on. It's free and accessible if you don't have Spotify, but I will also be posting on Spotify. My YouTube channel is at MHMT pod. If you just search Mental Health and Musical Theater, a podcast, it should pop up. Thanks for tuning in. Join me next week with my bestie, Jack Bausch, as we talk about the musical theater grind. That episode will be released a week from today. So yeah, love to you all. Bye.